Previously in Shadows of the South.
In the middle of the night, open their eyes, not alone, be enough to hide it. A pale figure, edge of the bed.
In the early hours of the morning, when the mind drifts between sleep and awareness, some people claim to have opened their eyes only to realize they were not alone. A pale figure, impossibly thin, crouched silently at the edge of the bed, waiting for the exact moment the darkness would no longer be enough to hide it. They called it the Rake.
Shadows of the South.
As digital communication continues to accelerate the exchange of narrative ideas, entities such as the Rake demonstrate how folklore adapts to contemporary modes of interaction. The collaborative nature of online storytelling allows collective imagination to produce figures that resonate with shared anxieties, reflecting underlying concerns that extend beyond the specific imagery used to represent them. The absence of a fixed canonical version permits continuous reinterpretation, enabling the narrative to evolve while preserving its essential thematic elements. Researchers examining the phenomenon often note parallels between the Rake and earlier mythological figures, characterized by distorted human features combined with ambiguous behavioral intentions. Such similarities suggest that the underlying structure of the story may derive from cognitive patterns that predate modern technology, resurfacing through new symbolic forms adapted to changing cultural environments. The continued popularity of the narrative also illustrates the human inclination to explore boundaries between the known and the unknown. Stories involving unexplained observation tap into fundamental concerns regarding vulnerability during periods of reduced awareness, particularly within private spaces associated with safety and rest. The possibility that an external presence could exist undetected within such environments challenges assumptions that contribute to psychological comfort, thereby increasing the emotional intensity associated with the narrative. From a psychological perspective, encounters with figures resembling the Rake may be interpreted as manifestations of perceptual ambiguity, combined with heightened emotional sensitivity during transitional states of consciousness. The period between sleep and wakefulness is associated with increased susceptibility to vivid imagery, particularly when environmental stimuli are limited and cognitive interpretation relies more heavily on internal pattern recognition. The human mind possesses a strong tendency to assign meaning to incomplete sensory input, often prioritizing interpretations that ensure survival even when evidence remains inconclusive. The form attributed to the Rake aligns with visual characteristics commonly associated with vulnerability and exposure, such as visible skeletal structure and absence of protective features like hair or clothing. Paradoxically, these traits can produce an intensified fear response precisely because they contrast with expectations of physical strength typically associated with threatening figures. The juxtaposition between apparent fragility and implied capability creates cognitive dissonance, encouraging prolonged attention and reinforcing memory consolidation. Cultural context further amplifies the interpretive impact of the narrative. Exposure to prior descriptions increases the probability that ambiguous sensory experiences will be interpreted according to familiar symbolic frameworks. In this manner, the legend perpetuates itself through recursive reinforcement, where each retelling strengthens the likelihood that future experiences will be categorized within the same conceptual structure. Although variations exist, numerous accounts share structural similarities that contribute to the perception of authenticity within the narrative framework. Witnesses frequently describe a sequence beginning with subtle environmental changes, such as an unusual silence or the impression that familiar spatial arrangements feel altered in a manner difficult to articulate. This stage is often followed by the visual identification of a figure positioned at the periphery of perception, initially interpreted as a shadow or distortion caused by low light conditions. As visual focus adjusts, the observer becomes aware of details inconsistent with ordinary explanation. The posture of the figure, frequently described as crouched yet balanced in a manner requiring significant physical tension, creates the impression that the entity is capable of rapid movement, despite remaining completely still. The elongated structure of the limbs contributes to a perception of unnatural proportions, reinforcing the sense that the figure does not conform to expected biological constraints. Another recurring element involves the description of eye contact. Witnesses often report the impression that the entity is fully aware of being observed, yet deliberately refrains from reacting in a manner consistent with instinctive defensive behavior. The stillness of the creature appears intentional, as though movement is unnecessary for achieving its objective. This behavioral pattern intensifies the emotional response of the observer, as the absence of clear threat escalation prevents the situation from reaching a resolution that might otherwise allow cognitive closure. The widespread recognition of the Rake can be traced to collaborative storytelling platforms that allowed users to contribute fragments of narrative detail, gradually forming a composite entity defined by recurring descriptive features. In many ways, the development of the legend Maros processes observed in traditional folklore, where repeated retelling refines imagery until a stable symbolic structure emerges. The distinction lies primarily in the speed with which the narrative evolved, compressing what would traditionally require generations into a relatively short period of digital interaction. Early references to the Rake describe encounters characterized by ambiguity rather than explicit confrontation. Individuals recount waking unexpectedly during the night with a sense that something in the room feels out of place, followed by the gradual recognition of a presence positioned at a distance close enough to eliminate uncertainty regarding its physical reality. The creature is often depicted as maintaining a crouched posture, balancing on elongated limbs with a stillness that suggests a deliberate effort to remain unnoticed, despite occupying an exposed position within the environment. In many versions of the narrative, witnesses describe experiencing difficulty interpreting the emotional significance of the encounter. The absence of immediate movement or overt aggression creates a paradoxical situation in which the observer cannot easily categorize the entity as either passive or hostile. This ambiguity contributes significantly to the psychological impact of the story, as uncertainty tends to prolong cognitive engagement with perceived threats, increasing the likelihood that the memory will persist long after the event concludes. The figure known as the Rake occupies a peculiar position in modern folklore, existing at the intersection between digital mythology and traditional patterns of fear that have appeared throughout human history. Unlike ancient legends shaped over centuries through oral storytelling, The Rake emerged in the early years of widespread internet communication, where anonymous accounts and collaborative narratives created a creature whose form feels strangely familiar despite lacking a clear historical origin. The persistence of the story demonstrates how contemporary environments can produce myths that follow the same structural patterns as older folklore, suggesting that the mechanisms responsible for generating fear remain consistent even when the medium changes. Descriptions of the Rake are remarkably consistent across independent reports. Witnesses commonly portray a humanoid entity characterized by extreme thinness, elongated limbs, and skin described as unnaturally pale, almost reflective under certain lighting conditions. The figure is frequently depicted as hairless, with proportions that appear slightly distorted when compared to the natural anatomy of a human being. Perhaps the most unsettling element of these descriptions is not the creature's appearance alone, but the behavior attributed to it. Rather than acting aggressively in a conventional sense, the Rake is often described as observing silently, maintaining prolonged eye contact, and demonstrating an unsettling patience that implies intent without revealing clear motivation. Accounts frequently emphasize the environment in which encounters occur. Many individuals report experiences taking place during nighttime hours, particularly in moments when the boundary between sleep and wakefulness becomes less distinct. This transitional state of consciousness may contribute to the vividness of the experiences, yet the consistency of descriptive details across unrelated testimonies continues to provoke curiosity among those who study contemporary myth formation. The repetition of similar narrative elements raises questions regarding whether the Rake functions purely as a fictional construct, or whether it represents the manifestation of a shared psychological archetype adapted to modern technological culture. Whether interpreted as a product of collective imagination or as an example of how modern communication reshapes traditional storytelling patterns, the Rake remains a compelling illustration of how fear adapts to evolving cultural contexts. The persistence of the image, characterized by stillness and silent observation, demonstrates that overt aggression is not always necessary to produce lasting psychological impact. In many cases, uncertainty itself becomes the most effective mechanism for sustaining attention. As long as individuals continue to experience moments of ambiguity between perception and interpretation, narratives such as the Rake will likely retain relevance, serving as symbolic expressions of concerns that extend beyond literal belief in supernatural entities. The quiet figure described in numerous accounts may ultimately represent the enduring human awareness that not all experiences can be explained immediately, leaving open the possibility that certain questions remain unresolved, not because answers do not exist, but because the process of searching for them continues to evolve. And perhaps that is why the story persists, repeated across conversations and preserved within digital archives, waiting for the moment when someone else, somewhere, wakes unexpectedly in the middle of the night with the unmistakable feeling that something is present, perfectly still, watching without making a sound.
Next episode in Shadows of the South.
Present feeds on something hunt for survival. Winter lasts long enough disturbing.